So what is the difference between XML and XAML? We know XML is a markup language, and that really is just a standard where we have opening tags and closing tags, and we have the data in between them. And I think we also understand that XAML is based on XML, which basically means that a XAML file is 100% an XML file. But what does that actually mean? I think the first challenge might be a perception issue. Is oftentimes when we try to learn XML, we think of XML as being data and somewhat like raw open-ended data. In reality, it's actually not like that. Although it is data, but it is often consumed by another system. So it is a data which is known to that system, and it is often an act of configuring that data. So it's not like we are defining some new data in a way, but we are configuring a system, and actually that's exactly what XAML is. So XML just provides the kind of the syntax really, and XAML builds upon that. And then when you are kind of creating a data or configuration or configuring a system for another system, that system often would have its own kind of some formatting or some kind of entities, its own, and I think it will make sense when I move forward with this, giving you an example. But this is kind of the first major difference is that typically we associate XML as being just a data, and that's okay. But the intention here is very different. Like you might be thinking of XML as a data, but XAML is actually not really data in that raw data in that way. It's actually a configuration of windows really, and also the behavior of that window as well in some ways. So that is one of the key kind of overall high level conceptual difference is XAML is a configuration. And what does that mean by configuration? So when we create a XAML file, like the first node would be a window. We are declaring a window. So a window is a known element that the XAML namespace knows about. And then we start configuring this window by setting its properties and then setting its content. And this content would be, a menu, a toolbar, other buttons, content, and all those things. So these content would also is also known objects. These are known to XAML. So basically what we do is, actually I have this open right here. The first tag, this is a XAML file. The first tag is a window. And let's forget about the namespaces right now, but this class, I don't want this to be too extensive about the XAML file format, but I just want to kind of very high level. Maybe I'll create another one later on. But we have the opening. We will stick to the main things. We have the opening tag as window. So this is something known to XAML namespace and XAML engine. So we are declaring a window, and then all these types that I'm declaring over here, like dock panel, menu item, button, all these things, this is not like an open-ended data that I'm declaring. This is actually entities that the XAML engine knows about. So what essentially what I'm doing is I'm creating these entities and I'm just configuring them. For example, I'm creating a window over here. I'm setting the height property to this, the width property to this, the title to this, and really I'm just configuring the XAML file. And this really is true for XML and XAML files. Is essentially, no matter how complex the XAML file is, it is essentially just a name value pairs, or a key value pairs are a quantity and it's value pairs, or whatever you might want to call it, but you have a quantity and then you have its value. So here you set the quantity. This is the window is a known quantity, and then this whole thing is its value, and this value really is the content. And then in the content inside, you define a menu, and then you define a content inside the menu. And likewise, for example, I have a button over here, a label over here. So a label, we know a label is a control, a label, and then we have the content. So essentially, we are configuring a known entities, setting its values. This is all we are doing in XAML. So one of the confusion that might come up in XAML is, is there, like, I think, are there any differences with XML and XAML? So there are no differences as such, but there are few things that are kind of like XAML interpretations, and they are just XAML interpretations. They don't break anything in XML, and let me explain that here. I think one of the confusion that can come up is probably with the dot, the way we use dot in XAML. For example, I have used dot over here. So you might be wondering that, we are setting something, a property of dock panel over here, and is this specific to XML or is this specific to XAML? Likewise, actually, let's start with this one first. We have this button content button dot content. What is this? So I think this is something I want to focus on, the dot. So first thing, I want to just confusion is that the dot that we have over here, this is actually it has no relevance in XML. In XML, it does not matter at all what this is. In terms of the XML, this whole thing is just one text. The dot is just part of the text, so it doesn't have any other meaning in terms of the XML. Think of it like you have a Gmail. You can have a first name dot last name at Gmail. The whole Gmail is still just a string. It's not like the dot is any specific meaning. So in terms of XML, the dot does not have any meaning, but XAML builds on that, and XAML gives the dot a meaning. And I think before I elaborate this further, let's just examine a simple XML file. So here what we have is, we have root element message, and it contains these other elements. So here is the second iteration of this file, and here I've introduced attribute. Attachment is now an attribute of the body, and this is just to kind of just to understand or refresh the XML constructs. In the XML, we either have elements or we have an attribute. Now the attribute or the element itself, it does not have any other meaning. The only identification is that if you use this syntax, it would be called attribute, but if you use this syntax, it would be called an element. And in fact, this is what I've done in the next iteration. In this iteration, I have provided attachment as an element. Here, attachment was an attribute. In both these cases, it essentially provides the same information. There is absolutely no difference. It's just a matter of choice, which way you like or not. And there are some differences, like capabilities, some restrictions, like if you use this format, then because it's an attribute and you can only have one attribute with this body, if you use this element, you can actually add more attachments because it's an element, and because a parent can have more elements of the same time. So that is, kind of how you make a choice if you want to make it an attribute or an element. But other than that, they provide essentially the same value, the same functionality. And XML, it doesn't matter, now what it means beyond that. It is not in the domain of XML. XML is just providing you the syntax. This is how you can describe this quantity, what this quantity is, what it represents. XML has nothing to say about that. So when you design a XAML engine and you create a XAML file that uses XML, now you can actually configure, you can actually design your system in a way that you can give specific meanings to these attributes and the quantities. And let's get to that. XAML actually does that exactly. So we saw that in XML, an attribute is just an attribute. It does not have any meaning. Now come back to XAML, and this is in terms of the XML, this is an attribute and this is an attribute. So when we basically see in XAML, this attribute can either be a property of this type, or it can be an event of this type. So from looking at the XAML, you would not be able to tell exactly, but again, this is the documentation, and these are kind of well known. When you become familiar with this, you kind of know what is a property and what is an event handler. But this is kind of the difference, how a simple attribute in XAML, which doesn't have any other meaning associated with that, when we use that in XAML, it can either be used to set a property, like this is a content, or it can be used like an event, like a button click. So this basically is a click event. We can go to so this is actually a function. So it's not a property, but it's actually a function. And so this is one difference. Now the second difference and the second confusion that might arise with XAML is the dot. What is the dot? We have this button dot content, and here also we have the doc panel dot doc. What actually this dot means? Is this an XML thing? So the answer is, it's not an XML thing. This dot is totally irrelevant in XML. There is no relevance to XML. In terms of XML, this whole thing is just one string. It's like you're having, say, a Gmail address, your first name dot last name at Gmail. So obviously the dot in the middle, you're using it, kind of to break your name. But it doesn't really, you can put dot anywhere. It doesn't have any meaning to your email address. And it's actually the same way. In XML world, this is just a valid tag. The only thing that matters for XML is that if you define a dot over here, you must define exactly the same dot, exactly the same text in the closing tag as well. That's what the XML needs. And now what does this do in XAML? Let's go a little bit deeper. So in this example, I've set the content property to button1, which mean that button1 is the text. But this is a second time, like sometime you might have a content, or you might, a content is a property, but you might have a property which is too complex to be set as a string. So there is a need, there is kind of a need in XAML to come up with this alternate way to define a complex property. And here, even though I'm still using a text for illustration, but this is the format. So basically what this means is you have a button is a predefined element. What this means is button, this is actually called element property, I think, syntax. So basically this means that button, this content is a property of button and you are setting that property. In the third example, this is kind of illustrates this point more, is here if you see in this window, let's run this too. So if you run this, we have button 1, button 2, and here, just for illustration, I've actually just added a checkbox and a radio button together as a content of this third button. And here it, and so obviously this is the content, and obviously this is a complex content, and we cannot accommodate that like as a text over here. And this is why we use this format. Again, this this is specific. This is just specific to the XAML. And then let's go to the second one. This is called attached properties. And again, the dot means that attached properties is kind of like a static property of another type. In this case, this is like the parent type is the doc panel, and this is a property of the parent type, and this is how we access it. We put the parent name, doc panel, dot, and doc, and then set the property. So again, this is totally valid in XML. In XML, you actually can have a dot. There are some other restrictions on the naming, but you can totally have a dot in the middle of an attribute name. And actually, just to illustrate this further over here, I think with this example, like for example, here I have the attachment element. Over here, what I've done is this is right now we are going back into the XML. So over here, I have defined the attachment as file.attachment. So XML this is still a valid XML, and even though this file is not even present over here, it doesn't mean anything for XML. The only thing it matters is that if you use this text, you have to use exactly the same text with the same dot in the same location. So for XML, what matters is that this whole thing is just a string, and this dot just happens to be part of the string, and you have the closing, exactly this same closing. So this this is kind of the this is the difference between the XML, is that this dot can appear confusing on this dot has actually a meaning in XAML, where it expect like a parent type or a known type before the dot, and then after the dot you access the property in XAML. But this is when we judge this file in terms of XML, it's just a valid XML file, and the dot does not have any meaning in XML, but it does have a meaning in XAML. So I hope this clears a few things up, and I think this was a very high level overview. I think we can create another video on more specifics of the XAML file format, but I think these things might confuse some people.